This experience happened to me in 2020 during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. The world was shutting down and everyone was stuck at home. Being an avid backpacker and camper, I saw this as the perfect opportunity to visit different national parks and enjoy the solitude. One of the places I chose was a secluded creek in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. Without revealing too much, let's just say that something happened with my job in 2019 that negatively impacted my reputation. As a result, I faced a lot of backlash, and a good number of people were upset with me. I had to completely overhaul my life, changing apartments, getting a new phone number, and eventually quitting my job. My mistake caused financial losses for several people, so the backlash wasn't unexpected. However, I didn't anticipate how far it would go. For a while, I was bombarded with harassment and even threatening texts from random numbers. I couldn't tell if it was one person using multiple numbers or a group of people. Eventually, the messages stopped, and I hoped the ordeal was over. Around this time, I wasn't working. I was taking time for myself, which was another reason I decided to travel around to different national parks. One day, I drove 3 hours to Rocky Mountain National Park, parked my truck, and started hiking up the trail to the creek. The park was completely empty, likely because of the lockdown and the fact that it was still winter. A thin layer of snow covered the ground, crunching loudly with every step I took. After a while, I reached the creek. Despite the cold, it wasn't frozen and was still flowing peacefully. It was exactly the escape I needed to detox from all the stress in my life. I ventured off the path a little to find a good spot to set up camp. Once my tent was up, I chopped some wood, started a fire, and cooked some sausages on my stove. As the fire crackled, I settled in with a book, losing myself in a few chapters as the sun began to set. When darkness fell, I turned on my headlamp. I decided to roll a joint, hoping to relax even further. After taking a few hits, my phone suddenly started buzzing in my jacket pocket. This was unusual. Apart from my family, no one really texts me anymore. Curious and slightly anxious, I pulled out my phone and saw a series of texts from an unknown number. My heart sank. The messages were coming from a number with a 203 area code, which I later found out was from Connecticut. My stomach churned as I read the first message. "How's your camping trip?" The second text said, "It's beautiful out here." The third read, "I see why you came up here." My default reaction was to respond with, "Who is this?" If they had stopped at, "How's the camping going?" I might have assumed it was a family member. But the way they were texting, as if they were physically there with me, set me on edge. To make matters worse, the weed had already kicked in, amplifying my paranoia. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was watching me. I stood up and did a complete 360, scanning the darkening woods surrounding my campsite. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows, and every rustle of leaves made my imagination run wild. Needing some reassurance, I went to my bag and grabbed my P365 handgun. Just holding it gave me a small sense of comfort. Normally, I'd put the fire out before calling it a night, but the thought of being in total darkness was far too unsettling. I decided to leave the fire burning and retreated into my tent, crawling into my sleeping bag while still clutching my phone. I stared at the screen, waiting for a response to my message. Nothing came. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I wished the weed would just wear off, but it was too late for that. I turned on my headlamp, trying to distract myself by picking up where I'd left off in my book. But between being high and the texts rattling around in my brain, it was impossible to focus. Eventually, I gave up and turned to YouTube, hoping videos would help me pass the time. Of all things, I ended up watching a murder documentary. In hindsight, not the smartest choice given my current situation. I was lost in the video when my phone buzzed again. Another text. It was a response to my earlier question, but it only said, "Doesn't matter anymore." My heart started pounding all over again. I typed back quickly, "How did you know I'm camping?" But as before, there was no reply. The anxiety weighed heavier on me with each passing second. Was this some kind of twisted prank by a friend or family member? Or was it one of the people who used to harass me? And if it was the latter, how on earth did they know I was camping here? I tried to calm myself, killing time by watching more YouTube videos, but the glow from the fire outside was fading fast. Soon, the only light would be the dim glow of my headlamp. The woods were eerily silent, as they often are in the winter, without the usual hum of insects. The stillness was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Normally, I'd savor the peace of a quiet forest, but tonight, it was anything but comforting. Then, the silence was shattered. I heard it, distinct, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps grew louder, approaching my tent, until they stopped just a few feet away. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I tightened my grip on the handgun, my finger hovering near the safety. Suddenly, there was a flash outside. It seemed like someone had either shined a flashlight at my tent or taken a picture. I didn't have to wonder for long. Soon I heard footsteps retreating, growing fainter until they disappeared into the silence of the woods. Just as I expected, my phone vibrated again. The same number sent me a photo. It was of my tent. Along with it came a text that read, "Have a good night's sleep." In that moment, it felt like my high completely evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and unexpected confidence. Fueled by the mix of fear and instinct, I unzipped the tent, stepped out, and fired 2 shots into the air. Almost instantly, I heard footsteps in the snow, this time hurried and retreating. Someone was running away. While it brought some relief knowing I had scared them off, it also deeply unsettled me. That meant they had been nearby, possibly still hiding in the distance, watching. I shouted a warning into the night and climbed back into my tent. After that, there were no more texts and no more footsteps. But I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, replaying everything that had happened, the adrenaline keeping me wide awake as if I'd downed 3 cups of coffee. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I dozed off. When I woke up to the morning sunlight, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Whoever had been stalking me clearly hadn't expected me to have a gun. I don't look like the type of person who would carry one, and truthfully, that was my first and only time firing it since I bought it. But it worked. Nearly 5 years have passed since that night, and I haven't been bothered since. Looking back, I can't imagine how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't been armed that night. It was a terrifying experience, one that still lingers in my memory, but thankfully, it served as a turning point. The remaining bedrooms were reserved for our parents. My Uncle Jim, a passionate hunter and fisherman, often went on camping trips specifically for hunting, traveling to various locations across the country. My dad, though an animal lover who wouldn't hurt a fly, occasionally joined him on these trips. Uncle Jim's 4-acre property included a large stretch of forest. He had marked many trees with red paint to outline the property line, beyond which was county-owned land. The nearest house in that direction was likely miles away. One afternoon during lunch, while our dads were chatting about hunting, my brother Adam, our cousins Jake and Joe, and I came up with an idea. We wanted to camp in the woods that night. Our dads, already a bit tipsy, quickly agreed. They were much more likely to say yes when they'd been drinking. Our moms, on the other hand, weren't thrilled about the idea, but they didn't explicitly forbid it either. So, with our dads leading the way, the four of us boys, me, Adam, Jake, and Joe, grabbed a tent and headed into the woods. Our sisters and girl cousins didn't join. This was strictly a boys-only adventure. As we ventured deeper into the forest, Joey, the youngest at 9 years old, started whining that it was too far. Our dads, being their usual mischievous selves, just laughed and teased him. That's how they were when they were together. Especially after a few drinks, they loved joking around and messing with us. For context, I was the oldest at 13, Adam and Jake were both around 10, and Joe was 9. We eventually reached a small clearing just beyond the property line, covered in soft, mossy ground that Uncle Jim called deer beds. He mentioned that he had used the spot for camping before and said it was perfect for us. With our dads slightly buzzed, they gave us a semi-serious lesson on setting up a tent. Of course, they made us help, so they wouldn't have to do all the work themselves. The tent was big enough for the four of us, especially since we were all still kids. Once it was pitched, we placed our sleeping bags inside. We did all of this while it was still daylight, knowing it would be much harder to handle in the dark. Afterward, we returned to the house and spent the rest of the afternoon playing games outside until dinner. At dinner, our moms voiced their concerns again, arguing that we were too young to camp out in the woods alone. Our dads brushed it off, assuring them we'd be fine. I distinctly remember my dad making a joke about being close enough to hear us scream if something went wrong. Classic dad humor. If something were to go wrong, we didn't fully realize it at the time. Later that night, our dads led us back into the woods to the tent. Armed with flashlights and extra blankets to keep warm, we were ready for the cold night ahead. I also brought along a deck of Uno cards to keep us entertained. Once we got settled inside the tent, my dad and Uncle Jim left to head back to the house. Suddenly, we were alone in the woods. To be honest, we weren't as close to the house as you might think. We were deep enough into the forest that no light from the house was visible. Once we got comfortable, we started playing Uno, and it turned out to be a great way to pass the time. The tent was lit by flashlights we had arranged in a circle, and everything seemed fine, until we heard a scream in the distance. It sounded like a girl's scream, and we immediately froze. All of us exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what we had just heard. Then I remembered that foxes are known to scream in a way that sounds eerily similar to a woman's scream. I shared this with everyone, and it seemed to calm the group down, especially Joe, who looked particularly freaked out. Reassured, we went back to playing Uno. I remember winning almost every round. No one brought up the scream again, at least not until it happened a second time. This time, it was much louder and much closer. And this time, it sounded far more human. Once again, we froze, and the tension in the tent skyrocketed. Joe looked like he was on the verge of tears. I told everyone to turn off their flashlights, and we crawled into our sleeping bags, sitting in complete darkness. None of us had the courage to run back to the house. There's something about the idea of running, about making noise in the woods and possibly being chased, that is just too terrifying. Somehow staying hidden inside a flimsy cloth tent felt safer than exposing ourselves outside. So we waited in silence, whispering to one another about what it could have been. When asked if it might still be a fox, I admitted, I don't know, hopefully. Then it happened. Someone heard it first. A sound of fast, crunching footsteps racing through the leaves, heading straight for our tent. We all sat up, wide-eyed, as the footsteps suddenly stopped. What followed was an ear-piercing, gut-wrenching scream, the same as before, but now just outside the tent. Before we could even process the terror, the tent started shaking violently. All of us screamed. Jake and Joe were screaming out of sheer fear, while my brother and I yelled things like, "Get out of here!" I scrambled to unzip the tent door as quickly as possible, and one by one, we bolted out into the woods, flashlights in hand. The only reason? The run back to the house that night was the most nerve-wracking moment of my life. A true fight or flight, life or death feeling. We screamed the entire way, and when we finally reached the property, we found our whole family already outside, alarmed by our panicked cries. Thankfully, all 4 of us made it back safely. We hurriedly explained everything, the screams, the tent shaking, and the terror we just experienced. Everyone was visibly shocked and horrified by what they heard. Then I noticed that our cousins Jamie and Christina, along with my sister, weren't outside with the rest of the family. My immediate reaction was to accuse my dad and Uncle Jim of sending one of the girls out to scare us. But when they showed us that the girls were already in bed, it became crystal clear. Whoever was out there was someone we didn't know. Our dads didn't waste time. They grabbed a couple of rifles and headed into the woods. After a while, they returned, having found nothing. The next day, we all went back to the woods to collect the tent and our other gear. Unsurprisingly, that was the last time we ever camped in those woods. In fact, after that night, we didn't even play outside after dark anymore. What kid would after going through something like that? To this day, I still have no idea who or what was outside our tent that night, or why they were doing what they did. Now, what I'm about to share with you is another story, one that still leaves me questioning reality. It happened to my dad and me just 2 years ago, and even now, thinking about it gives me chills. I know how it sounds, and honestly, if I were you, I'd probably be skeptical too. But I swear to you, every word of this is true. 2 years ago, my dad and I went camping in a remote area deep in the countryside. Camping was something we enjoyed together, a way to disconnect and escape the daily grind. This particular spot had hiking trails, zip lines, and a bit of a touristy vibe, but it also held deep history as it was located on Native American lands. The first night was perfect. Families at nearby campsites, campfires glowing, kids laughing, the kind of peaceful evening you hope for when you go camping. We cooked hot dogs, roasted marshmallows, cracked open a few beers, and even chatted with some of the other campers. It was an ideal start to the trip. But the second night, that's when everything changed. The park staff informed us that we were the only ones who had booked a campsite for the night. At first, we were excited, a whole campground to ourselves. It sounded peaceful and serene. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and taking it easy. At one point, we even listened to a scary podcast by the river, laughing about how we were leaning into the spooky vibe of having the campground all to ourselves. As the sun started to set, we felt great. A little buzzed from a couple of beers and satisfyingly tired from our day outdoors. We decided to head to the park's information center to charge our phones, completely unaware that our night was about to take a chilling turn. As we headed back to our campsite to grab some snacks before it got too dark, an unsettling feeling crept in. The woods felt off. The air seemed heavier and the sky had this strange tint, like twilight was refusing to end. My dad turned to me and said, "Doesn't this feel weird, like we're in some kind of dream?" He was right. The forest felt endless, stretching in every direction, and my chest tightened with the growing sense that we weren't alone. We didn't say much after that, just kept walking. both of us glancing over our shoulders like we expected something to emerge from the trees. Once back at camp, we stayed close to the fire. We didn't talk about the strange feeling. We didn't have to. It was like we silently agreed to pretend everything was fine, hoping that normalcy would keep the unease at bay. We roasted marshmallows, played some music, even smoked a little weed to try and distract ourselves. Not your typical father-son bonding moment, but it helped lighten the mood. As night fell and the fire became our only source of light, the unease deepened into something darker. Around 9 p.m., while we were making s'mores, we heard it, a loud bang, like a tree falling. It was sudden, close, and echoed through the woods from the direction of the river, maybe 100 yards away. We grabbed our flashlights and shined them toward the sound, but the forest revealed nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes, nothing. Bigfoot, we joked nervously, both letting out uneasy laughs. We didn't believe ourselves. A few minutes later, it happened again. Louder this time, but farther away. The same heavy, thunderous sound. We scanned the forest with our lights, but the darkness swallowed everything outside the small circle of trees around us. Then the third bang came, closer now, and fear truly hit us. It felt like whatever was making the noise was moving toward us, circling our campsite. Before we could process it, a fourth bang echoed. This time less than 20 yards away. That's when the adrenaline kicked in. Whatever high I'd had from the weed was gone in an instant. My dad turned to me, eyes wide with fear, and we both knew we needed to act fast. We threw the last of the firewood onto the flames, hoping the fire would scare off whatever was out there, and scrambled into the tent. My dad followed right behind me, moving slower than I'd like, and as he reached the tent, the loudest bang yet shook the ground. My dad froze, staring into the darkness. "What is it?" I whispered, terrified. "It's standing there," he muttered, his voice trembling. "What's standing there?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I don't know," he said, still staring into the void. Finally, he dove into the tent, zipping it up behind him. He sat by the entrance, clutching the only weapon we had, a small knife that felt utterly useless. I buried myself under my sleeping bag, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. Then came a low, vibrating hum, a sound I can't fully describe. It wasn't just noise. It was a feeling that filled the air and pressed against our chests. My dad whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded, too scared to speak. The vibration was soon joined by another sound, guttural, alien-like, and completely inhuman. It reminded me of something out of a horror movie, like the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. We froze, too terrified to move or make a sound. I had a small mesh window near my sleeping bag, but I couldn't bring myself to look out. The fear of being seen paralyzed me. Then, in the middle of all the chaos, the strangest thing happened. We blacked out. Neither of us remembered falling asleep. My dad was still clutching the knife when we woke up, lying in the middle of the tent. I woke up in a panic, feeling as if something had been standing over me. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was dead. My dad checked his, also dead. Both had been fully charged the night before. We stepped outside to relieve ourselves, standing back to back out of fear. The air was cold and still, and everything felt wrong. The food we'd left on the table was untouched, and the fire we'd stoked before diving into the tent had burned down to ash as if we'd been gone for hours. We spent the rest of the night in silence, too shaken to speak. When morning finally came, we packed up quickly, barely saying a word until we were in the car. On the drive home, we finally talked about it, and we realized we both felt the same thing that night. Watched, hunted, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. When we told my mom, she thought we were crazy, suggesting we might have inhaled something or been drugged. But it wasn't that. Whatever happened that night, It was real. We both experienced it. To this day, we don't know what it was. We never saw it fully, but my dad came closest. Whatever he saw, it wasn't human. It wasn't natural. We've never heard a story quite like ours, and we've never been back to that campsite or camping at all since. I don't think we ever will.